Oh my goodness, that was absolutely amazing. Let's give it one more hand for them. They did an awesome job of that. So good, y'all. So good. So back in 2005, I got caught up in one of the earliest, and I think you'll agree, nerdiest, early internet sensations. Now, if you remember back in 2005, this was back before Facebook and clearly back before TikTok. But if you kind of think about like the Ice Bucket Challenge or the everything so mindful and demure, this was kind of that thing back when we were all still trying to figure out who would be our top 8 on MySpace. This trend was called Google whacking. And I promise you, it's way nerdier than it sounds. The objective of this was to type a 2-word phrase into Google without any punctuation that would yield exactly one result. Exactly one. And so I started trying to do this, and I spent weeks trying to come up with a 2-word phrase, all these different things. And after a few weeks, I finally found the 2-word phrase that would yield one result on Google at the time. That phrase was Anglophonic septuagenarians. Clearly a phrase we all use all the time that means people who are in their 70s who enjoy the sound of the English language. And the way this game worked is that once you found your 2-word phrase, you would submit the link along with the 2 words to googlewhack.com, and they would put it there, which would mean that there would now be 2 hits. So no one would ever be able to get that exact same Google whack again. Now, Google whacking doesn't exist anymore for a variety of reasons. And I would say not only was it because people were embarrassed to say that they did it, but it was also because Google and other online organizations have changed their algorithm, right? Can you imagine how awesome it would be to type in what you wanted to Google or Bing or whatever and end up in one result and it actually be the one you want instead of like AI or ads or 10,000 different options? There's just no way to get one result anymore. And I think I may say the same thing that many of us are thinking right now, which is that we seem to be overwhelmed whenever we try to find something, whether it is searching for a microphone on Amazon, whether it's typing something into Google, or just even trying to figure out what type of deodorant it is that we want to buy at the local grocery store. In fact, a recent study came out that said this, and I think it's really apt. Talking about Amazon shoppers, it said that 74%, that's 3 in 4 people, of consumers surveyed walked away from purchases simply because they felt overwhelmed this past quarter. A few months ago, we did a survey of the people who were here at the venues, and the number one thing that people said that they felt was that they felt overwhelmed. And it makes a lot of sense, y'all. Companies are spending billions of dollars trying to overwhelm us. And while we would say probably in the abstract that we like choices, right? We like choices of the freedoms of the things that we get to do. In the real world, it can create a sense of overwhelm and ultimately of inaction. You know, I wonder how often we don't take action because we get stuck in this indecision loop, which is a result of both the societal pressures of the companies that are spending billions of dollars trying to get our attention, plus the fact that ultimately, I think most of us just want to make other people happy. It's not that we're trying to do something wrong. It's in fact the opposite. It's just that there are literally so many forces outside compelling us to move in the direction that someone else wants us to do. You know, even decisions like what to binge on television are way more difficult than what they used to be. I'm old enough that I remember when there were just a handful of channels and you would actually change I'm not going to explain that, where you actually had a limited number of things that you could watch on television. And now it seems like it's overwhelming. And so today, what we're going to do is, as we've been going through this series here at the venues that we started a few weeks ago called The Good Place, What Happens When We Die, we're going to kind of try to isolate down the things that are actually important, to try to cut through the overwhelm. And so we're going to be talking about this show called The Good Place, which, by the way, you can stream on Netflix or Apple TV. And it really plays a lot with this question of what happens in the afterlife and how some of the characters ended up there according to this fictionalized show. One of the big through lines through this show that I hope that you all see is that while there are a lot of different ideas and a lot of different opinions about how you get to the afterlife, what happens in the afterlife, and honestly, there's a lot of different opinions that are even justified by the Bible about what that looks like, I think that we can pretty clearly say that the kind of life that you live and the connections that you make here on earth live on even after you're gone. So today we are going to take a few minutes and look at a very particular character by the name of Chidi Anagonye. And before he died, he was a professor of ethics who was both a people pleaser and someone who was incredibly indecisive to the point that it was annoying. So this morning, I want you to start off by taking a quick look at this clip where his childhood best friend, a guy by the name of Uzo, and him are having dinner and trying to decide if Chidi should be the best man at his wedding. So I want you to take a quick view at this clip. Fortunately for most of us, when we can't make a decision, it does not result in an air conditioner falling on us. But oftentimes when we can't make a decision, the result is something much more severe than just not being able to have the soup that we wanted either. You see, oftentimes when we get so overwhelmed to a point of not being able to make a decision, it ends up creating a space where others don't trust us, and maybe worse, where we can't trust ourselves to make the important decisions, which I think, especially in the world that we live in right now, is uniquely problematic when we need to get on the same page, move the same direction to help fight some of the ways that many people around us are being oppressed. And that's kind of the main thought that I want us to start with today. The place that I want to just kind of couch this morning's teaching in is this idea that I want you to leave with today, and that's this: that creating the good place here in Springfield doesn't require uniformity, but it requires clarity, okay? I'm gonna say that again because I want us to kind of be able to unpack that. So I want us to kind of sit in that space. That creating the good place here in Springfield doesn't require uniformity, but it does require clarity. And so as we're kind of thinking about this, as we think about the life that Chidi lived, the way that he got to the good place, as we think about the ways that we live and kind of thinking about the different ways that we can learn about this, I want us to really hone in and think about what it might look like today if we just lived a life that was more clear with each other and how that might result in loving each other better. When Jesus was on the earth, there were a lot of people trying to figure out uniformity. They would look at these texts that we would now call the Old Testament, and they'd be like, we all need to figure out exactly how to do this. And the religious leaders at the time would have pages and pages of laws of exactly how you followed each one of the commandments. Jesus came into the setting and started saying some things that caused a little bit of controversy. And by the way, as we do this, I want you to understand that when I say something here on stage, when Philip or other people say something here on stage, it doesn't mean that we have all the answers either. We're just working it out with you, which is why, as we're talking, if you have a question, feel free to text it in. We may not have time for it at the end of the service today, but even if we don't, we'll make sure that not only will we answer you directly by tomorrow, but this week we'll actually post it on social media so that everyone can kind of follow the questions, even if you didn't ask them yourself. In the Bible, there is a series of teachings that Jesus does that I truly wish that all of the politicians who are so adamant about putting parts of the Bible in schoolrooms or in courtrooms, instead of worrying about the 10 Commandments, would worry about these. And it's the Sermon on the Mount that Jesus speaks in Matthew that we often call the Beatitudes. It's really this notion that he's saying, like, look, you may have heard it said this way, but maybe there's a different way towards love that we need to be living. And today, we're going to be spending about 20 minutes looking at a very specific example where Jesus teaches in the book of Matthew, which if you had a Bible and you went to the New Testament, it's the very first book of the New Testament, the 5th chapter, Matthew 5. And starting in verse 33, Jesus says this, and I want you to kind of see this as the beginning of this discussion. He says, again, you have heard that it was said to people long ago, do not break your oath, but fulfill to the Lord the vows you have made. But I tell you, do not swear an oath at all. And I know this may feel a little bit weird as the initial place to start this conversation because you're like, yeah, Chris, if I remember correctly, like almost times that I see the Bible most commonly actually used in a physical place, people are swearing an oath on it, right? They're standing in a courtroom being like, I swear to tell the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth. Or they're standing on Capitol Hill saying something like, I swear to uphold the Constitution. Does that mean that we should just give everybody a pass on that and say it doesn't matter if you follow through with what you're saying? Well, while the irony is not lost on me that there may be some complications there, I don't think that that's actually what is getting to be the main point here. I think Jesus is going to end up offering something to us that is way, way more profound than just a question of, did you swear something? Was it a vow? Or did you just intend to make sure that other people were loved better? And I want to start off today by offering this thought, that it's a huge paradigm shift that Jesus offers, which is that changing your mind can sometimes be really good as long as it helps others flourish. That changing your mind can sometimes be really good as long as it helps others flourish. I know a lot of times we seem to have this idea that, like, we've got an idea and we're kind of stuck in that idea, or we seem to say, like, we can just change with whatever winds we want. But one of the driving forces that I hope that we see through this teaching is that it is a great idea to change your mind sometimes, but we should have a reason for doing that. And that reason should be that it helps other people around us flourish. This really is the push to make sure that those around us are getting to the good place. And I get it. You might hear that and think, well, obviously, Chris, we all change our minds. That's cool. But what Jesus says here is, I think, something way bigger, because he starts off with this notion that you have heard it said, but I say something different. Okay? You've heard it said this way, but I have this other idea. And you might be like, well, where did that come from? In the Old Testament that we would call, or the Hebrew scriptures, that the people who would have heard Jesus reading this from or saying these words from, they would have been very familiar with text like what's up on the screen that shows up in Numbers and other places where they would have had this idea that God said, whenever you make a vow, you keep that vow to the letter. And the problem with that is that sometimes people can keep the letter of the law while ignoring the spirit of the law. They can say, yeah, like I followed exactly what I said I was going to do, but I didn't do what it was intended to do. And so what Jesus is saying here, what he starts off by arguing is that, yeah, you may have heard it said this way, and they would have. This would have been something that they would have heard from their teachers, from their parents, from synagogue, all the time growing up, and they would have had this drilled into their mind. But Jesus says, I tell you that there's a different path here. This is something that would have been absolutely mind-blowing to them. And it's something that Jesus does consistently through this teaching. In fact, 6 times during this teaching, he says something like, you heard it said, but I say instead. And just after this one where Jesus says, don't swear an oath, is where he says, like, you've heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, but I tell you, instead of seeking retaliation, seek reconciliation. And here what Jesus says is that the old standard of breaking your vows is good, but it just doesn't go far enough because people can figure out ways to get around the letter of the law. So he says, let's just get out of that system. And while that statement by itself may not be mind-blowing to you, I do want you to think about how mind-blowing it would have been for them. Here are these people who had been so steeped in a religious ideology. The original listeners all of a sudden now are hearing this religious teacher, because Jesus, by the way, wasn't a Christian. Jesus was a Jew, and the people who were following Jesus around, most of them were Jewish. And so they see this good Jewish man saying, yeah, the way that you've been raised needs to shift a little bit, because the way that we have been doing this hasn't allowed the fullness of human flourishing, and that would have been mind-blowing to them. I got to thinking while I was prepping for this, like, what was the last time that I had my mind blown like that? And I think it was this. It was when I first learned that the plural of octopus isn't octopi, it's octopuses. And if you don't believe me, look it up, it's true. You can use both. But when I first heard that, I was like, what? My entire life has been a lie. The other times, though, that I've had this mind-blowing experience in faith situations largely were rooted around this concept that God could change God's mind. Now, I grew up in a way that many of you might have, which was hearing this thing all the time that God never changes. God's the same yesterday, today, and forever. The God that we're around today is the same God as the God forever and ever and back. But then I did this really radical thing. I read the Bible. And when I started doing that, it changed my opinion of the God that I had been raised around. Because throughout the Bible, there are multiple occasions where the authors write that God changed God's mind. And one of the most common stories of this is the story of Jonah. You might have heard this growing up where like there's Jonah and this big fish, and the fish eats Jonah and then barfs, and Jonah's on the island, like on the land in Nineveh. And the people in Nineveh were really rotten people. And so Jonah comes in and is like, repent. And they do, like that. And all of a sudden, they're just starting to love each other. And then it has this really weird verse in Jonah that says this, that when God saw what they did, when the Ninevites, what they did, how they turned from their evil ways, that God changed God's mind. I want you to take a second and just allow that to be mind-blowing to you. And while you're doing that, I want to ask you this question, and I'm going to give you a few seconds to think about it after I show it on the screen, and it's this. Are there specific beliefs that you either used to hold on to or still do hold on to, despite them not creating a space for human flourishing? I want you to think about that. Are there beliefs that you have, or beliefs that you were raised with that you've gotten rid of, that don't allow for human flourishing? This afternoon, by the way, when you're eating lunch, let's think about that a little bit. Let's allow that to kind of ruminate and to marinate in our heart. And let me give you permission, not that you need it, but that if you have those beliefs, you can let them go. You do not have to hold on to things that hurt other people. In my life, a very specific example of this that I'm thankful that I've been able to let go of is that when I was in high school, I was really involved in something called apologetics. Apologetics are basically Christian debate club, right? And the whole notion was we would just like read our Bible as deeply as we could so we can get into arguments, not only with people of other faiths, but even just like other Christian people. And we'd be like, my church is better than your church because X, Y, Z. A few years ago, I had a situation where this kind of played out, and I was able to see my growth. And I'm not perfect at it yet by any means, but a few years ago, I had a former friend of mine who I used to do debate with, who sent me a message because he found out that I was going to the venues, and he was a pastor at another church not too far from here. And he said, hey, you know what I'd really like you to do is, would you come to church with me and let's have a debate in front of my congregation. And we can debate things like women in leadership or queer acceptance or whatever. And at first I was like, yeah. And then I thought about it and I offered him a different option. I said, what about this? What if we have some of the people from the venues come and they can share about how love has driven them to care for their neighbors better? And you have some of the people from your church come and they can share about how your theology has encouraged them to love their neighbors better. And then he blocked me on Facebook. I am so thankful for the ways that I've seen so many of you grow in ways that you break free of the beliefs that harm people. I love when people share with me stories that say, you know, Chris, I used to believe that I was always going to be excluded from any kind of a faith community. But then one day I stumbled in here, or I lost a bet, so I came to the venues one Sunday. And when I got here, I realized that people could hold faith and loving unapologetically everyone together. And I found this place, and I realized that change was a good thing. The kind of change that Jesus is talking about here is very specific. So I want you to kind of see what that looks like too. In verse 34, he says this, but I tell you, do not swear an oath at all, either by heaven, for it's God's throne, or by the earth, for it is God's footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it's the city of the great king. And do not swear by your head, for you cannot make even one hair white or black. And I get it, you might be reading this and be like, look, Chris, got it, done and done. I've never one time sworn an oath on a footstool. I've never sworn on Jerusalem. I'm solid, right? I'm good to go. But what it seems like Jesus is doing here is saying that the systems that people used to use to justify their belief systems while simultaneously hurting other people needed to change. In other words, and I could be wrong about this, but what it seems like Jesus is doing is saying that the things that we've often relied on to tell us what we should do need to be reevaluated. What if the government and the people that we have long looked up to aren't perfect? What if we have to ask questions like, what if my pastor makes a mistake? By the way, incredible leadership this last week from Philip. By the way, if you have not seen his random thought from last week, where he said, look, I said something, it was an ad-libbed thing, and I realized that I wasn't being the truest self that I could be. To me, that is incredible leadership. Thank you, Philip. And it might even be that we need to ask that question about the other systems that we have faith around. Like, what if we haven't been reading the Bible the right way? What if we've been so concerned with being right that we've missed being loving? In her book, Saving Jesus from Those Who Are Right, which you talk about an incredible title, by the way, Dr. Carter Haywood, who was one of the first women ever ordained by the Episcopalian Church, wrote this. She said, the Jesus story is about our relational power. It is a story told to empower us, a story told to cut through the illusion that we are impotent in relation to evil. For violence generates only more violence. We cannot teach one another not to kill by killing those who do. We cannot engender compassion by seeking to hurt people who hurt us. To come out as a passionate lover of God in the world does not require an extroverted personality. It requires persons who are quiet and reflective, or flamboyant and charismatic and scholarly and activist and artistic and hardworking and playful and prayerful, who are confident in their own and others' ability to God and their willingness to struggle together toward embodying the justice love of God. That is dynamite, y'all. Maybe what Jesus was saying here is that our goal is not to be right, but to be loving. That our goal here is not to make sure that we are uniform, but rather that we seek unity. Our goal is that we need to not swear by the government or the Bible or our pastor or the hair of our chinny chin chin, which if we ever do that, I've got a huge advantage. But maybe the point of the story is that we could just see the justice love of God in each other. That we could look at people around us and say, that is my sibling who I love because they're unequivocally good. They need to be affirmed and celebrated right where they are. That the power structures that we've had around us could be part of the problem. One of the reasons, by the way, that Chidi's character can be so annoying at times was his lack of ability to make decisions or to change, which leaves everyone around him in a lurch. But fortunately, he does grow from this. And that's actually the second and last thing I want to share with you today, and that's this. Clarity is kindness. It's really simple, but really complex. Clarity is kindness. When we are trying to figure out how to make this world a better place, being clear is key. The idea that clarity is something that we should push into has been a huge push lately in leadership circles, right? When I was a teacher, people used to say, be clear with your students. That's the only kind thing to do. If you read leadership blogs or listen to leadership podcasts, they will say over and over again, be clear. Brené Brown said it this way, of the behaviors that leaders identified as barriers to courage, there was one issue that leaders ranked as the greatest concern: avoiding tough conversations, including giving honest, productive feedback. I have learned something about clarity and the importance of hard conversations that has changed everything. It's simple but transformative. Clear is kind, unclear is unkind. And I think we all, if given the option, want to be kind. That's what makes Springfield a better place. But how do we do that? How do we move from the space of wanting to people please to the place of being honest and kind to those around us? Well, one of the options is to just do the easy thing and say that everything around us is hunky-dory. And by the way, that's exactly what Chidi does initially. So I want you to take a look at this.
Whoa, new boob.
I don't know if you've ever been in that situation before where you told a little white lie, quote unquote, to make somebody else happy, and it ended up backfiring on you. We've tried really hard to just go the easy way on someone, and in the end, sometimes it makes it worse. Which is why I think Jesus wraps up this teaching by saying this very clear statement. All you need to say is simply yes or no. Anything beyond that comes from the evil one. When we try so hard to posture and position what we want, that we rely on external sources without being true to ourselves or others around us, we end up not being true to the most important things. It's easy, but it's not kind. You know, I think what is possible that Jesus is saying here is that you already have enough power. You are already good enough. If something doesn't feel right, you can say, that is wrong. And if something does feel right, you can trust your heart, which I know, by the way, goes against what many of us might have been taught when we were growing up. But the truth is that you are intrinsically good. And just starting with that guideline, that even if it doesn't work for everyone else, that it can work for who God has put a spirit in your heart to say, that it really can push you towards clarity. Here at the Venues, we only have 4 values: affirming and inclusive, social justice, curiosity and skepticism, and intellectual humility. And people sometimes wonder why we start off with things like it's Pride Month or being affirming all of the time. It starts really because of this banner that we have out front that says that we're not for everyone because we're for everyone. And we'd want to be clear about that from the beginning. You know, there are some people that's not their jam for, and that's okay, by the way. But we say that we would rather be clear up front because sometimes people will get hurt if we're not going to be clear. You see, being clear, not about who we want to be, but about who we are, is really, really critical. Sarah Nave Fisher, who is the pastor at University Christian Church in Maryland, recently wrote this, and I want you to see this because it's so important as we're entering Pride Month. So we're going to skip the video and go to the slide that has this text on it. It says this: being affirming, whether or not you have an official designation, is about a lot more than rainbows. So before you put a rainbow next to your church's logo, ask yourself, if a trans person came to your church, would they, after an appropriate amount of time, be welcome to teach Sunday school? Would they be elected as an elder or in another leadership role? If you aren't sure, or if it would cause conflict in the church if that happens, please don't set up a booth at Pride. This is the same thing as telling someone with celiac that your bread is gluten-free, but dusting your hands with wheat flour before you make it. I am so thankful to say that here at the Venues, I know for sure what the answer to that is. If someone comes in who is lesbian or gay or bi or trans or poly, we welcome you full, unequivocally. You are welcome here in all capacities because we want to celebrate the way that God has made you and shaped you. You see, I would much rather find a place where people can all be safe and affirmed than anything else on that. I know it can be hard during Pride Month, or really any time, to determine what is real and what is fake. It can be hard to determine if a company is just using it as a capitalist marketing campaign to put rainbows at the front of their store, or if it's true. Here's what I can tell you about the Venues, though. Pride Month is June, but we celebrate Pride July through May as well, okay? And unequivocally, when there are algorithms that try to overwhelm us, we will choose to be clear about the fact that this will always be a welcoming place for everyone. And for that reason, I am so thankful for the ways that you all continue to show that love and to make sure that love is clear so that we can make Springfield the good place.